You want to hurt me? Go right ahead if it makes you feel any better. I'm an easy target. Yeah, you're right. I talk too much. I also listen too much. I could be a cold-hearted cynic like you. But I don't like to hurt people's feelings. Well, you think what you want about me. I'm not changing. I like me. My wife likes me. My customers like me. Because I'm the real article. What you see is what you get.
Why do you think people connect so much with John Candy, and what is his place in comedy history?
First, I think that people relate to his humanity. I think it's almost a cliche maybe, but you look at the sparkle, and there's a photograph on the cover of my book. You see the sparkle in his eyes. Everyone sees the vulnerability. A lot of comics don't have, a lot of comedian actors don't have that. They have a different kind of aggressive attitude. But he had a vulnerability that, people wanted to cuddle him. They wanted to hug him. And he also brought like a character like Del Griffith. It's no secret that my first chapter of my book is I Like Me, which is the speech from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And in the Colin Hanks's film is also called I Like Me. We all get the thing we see about John Candy is that this is a guy who could have been underestimated, but stood up for himself and everyone else. So that vulnerability and being willing to be human in the service of comedy and storytelling, how could you not like this guy?
Yes, that is Paul Myers, author of the new book, John Candy, A Life in Comedy. And you've tuned into another episode of Comedy History 101, where we school you in comedy. I am Harmon. Hello. And Paul has previously been on CH101, where we talked about his other book, Kids in the Hall, One Dumb Guy. And his new book is not only a deep dive into John Candy's comedy history, but also Second City comedy history, SCTV comedy history, and that early Renaissance era of Toronto comedy history, which begot such comedy icons as Dan Aykroyd, Catherine O'Hara, Andrea Martin, Eugene Levy, etc., etc. But before we jump into the episodes, of course, a few quick plugs. On Thursday, September 11th, 9:30 at the Players Theater in the Village, I'll be presenting my show, AI versus Human Roast Battle. Who is funnier, human or AI? Well, come out and see a machine learning AI take on a human rapper in a comedy roast battle of tomorrow. And on September 18th, 7 p.m. at Young Ethel's in Park Slope, I'll be presenting my show, That 80s Improv Challenge. Yes, 3 improv teams compete by creating clips based on obscure videos of the 1980s. And of course, on September 26th, Friday, at the Red Room in the Lower East Side, I'll be presenting my show, Tale. No dumb themes, no hokey gimmicks. Tale brings you the best in New York storytelling. And you can find out all about my show dates on my site, harmonleon.com, or on the social medias at harmonleon. Also, friends, show Comedy History 101 a little love. Give us no less than 5 stars on iTunes, Spotify. Leave a comment. Pass an episode on to a friend. And you can follow us on social media, on Instagram at ComedyHist101, or on our site, ComedyHistory101.com. And now, without further ado,
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
I'm trying to use the phone!
it's
Comedy History 101.
Hey, Paul, how are you?
I'm good. You?
Yeah, doing good. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, as someone who interviews people a lot, do you enjoy being interviewed?
Are you starting the recording?
Yeah, we're rolling.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure. What I enjoy is learning from other people things that I didn't know. You know what I mean? Like when I was a kid, I would read liner notes on an album, and I'd see that, you know, an album was produced by somebody or engineered by somebody, and I'd think, I wonder what they did when they did this overdub or something like that. And then my job now is I get to talk to people and be controlling the remote for that, you know. So, hey, I talked to Mitchell Froome, the producer, as an example. And I said, hey, so when you recorded that binaural recording of thing with you and Chad Blake, and like I have all the notes that I want to ask, and then but instead of just being a nerd in a record shop, which I am most of the time, I get to do it, you know. So with comedy, it's even cooler to, you know, talk to all the people who played with John Candy. And sometimes you do end up telling them, you know, thank you for making what you made, because, you know, this is my chance to. How often does a fan really get to do that? Like Steve Martin, I had it for this book, and I got to tell Steve Martin, just before we go forward, you've done so many great things for, you know, telling people what comedy is and telling people like the serious stuff that Steve Martin does. And he said, oh, well, I didn't expect that. Yeah, Jeff, well, thank you. You know, and it was like, because I didn't just say, I loved your Wild and Crazy Guy album, you know, like, so anyway, I just answered your question.
Which he would love.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Though you would have questions about it. I would want to ask him about that.
Yeah, exactly, because, you know, I am intrigued with, like, he did a Steve Martin did a master class in comedy, and I'm like, you know, that's an interesting thing, and it was very serious, like, so, yeah, and, you know, he's a very serious guy, as we all know.
Yeah, Pandemic. I had the masterclass series and saw
so did I. I got it for my birthday one year. I got a pass for my birthday, and it was like, it saved me throughout the pandemic. Although I haven't gone back since.
Yeah, neither have I. I went through like all of them, and then I was suddenly like on, here's a crazy hypnotist. I was like, oh, this is scraping the bottom of the masterclass barrel. It's like, okay, I've gone through.
The Amazing
David
Frank
Lynch.
shows you how I do the card trick. Yeah.
You
grab your mother's deck of cards.
But your book, it's like not only a great slice of John Candy history, it's a great slice of Second City history, SCTV history, also that Renaissance era of early Toronto comedy history. It got me Googling a lot. I Googled for a Matt Street view of the 505 Club.
Yes. No, I do that with books too now. I read Beatle histories. I read like where Paul McCartney rehearsed and like, you know, where he auditioned drummers, and I'm like, and then you see, oh, look, it's steps from their hotel. Like you can just put it together in your head like a detective. So yeah, I'm glad you did that with my book. Yeah. And it's for me being from Toronto and it's hard to believe I was ever too young for anything, but I was too young to be part of that scene. But I knew those names, and I would always hear that, you know, that Martin Short and everybody hung out at 1063 Avenue Road in Toronto.
I did a street view of that as well. It's just a house with so much magic that took place where they would just play Albert Brooks albums and
the Comedy -1. Yeah, no, I mean, and that to me is like, I also knew the Comedy -1 album from hearing it on something like Dr. Demento or one of those FM radio comedy shows that happened in the 70s, where it'd be like Sunday night at 10 or 11.
Now we come to the section called Comedy -1. Please open the album up so you have your script in front of you.
Last time we were talking about your book, Kids in the Hall. Since then, I've been to Toronto, and I took a sojourn to the Rivoli, which is on Queen Street. So it was roughly around that area, this famous iconic speakeasy that Dan Aykroyd ran after hours for all like the Second City and actors in town.
Yeah, and people who worked in restaurants and hospitals and stuff, who worked all night and they needed a place to unwind and frankly have a drink. In a town where the bars closed. I'm not sure if they closed at 1 in those days. It might have even been earlier. And there were no late night bars in Toronto. So that was the other thing. It's not like they became criminals just because they wanted to be criminals. They needed a place to hang out. So they made these clubs, you know, which is legal because it's a club. You have to buy a membership. We called them booze cans. You know, when you're in Toronto, you call them a booze can. In those days, anyway.
Yeah. So as a kid, when did Johnny Toronto first come onto your radar? Not his alter ego, but John Candy himself.
Yeah, John Candy. The first time I saw John Candy, was aware of him, was on a kid show that was a kid show for adults that was on at like 4 in the afternoon, 5 in the afternoon or something like that on CBC. And it was called Coming Up Rosie. And it was named after the star Rosemary Radcliffe, I think.
The greatest little breakfast in town. Eat 'em up, baby. The greatest little breakfast in town. Go on out and buy some. The greatest little breakfast in town.
And Dan Aykroyd was in it, and sometimes Catherine O'Hara would be in it. And I didn't know Second City Television hadn't gone on the air yet, but I knew these people, or maybe it had gone on the. I can't remember exactly the chronology, but I know that I had not gone to the Second City Theater and ever saw them perform. So I didn't know that this little core of people that were doing this kids show were also involved in real comedy. You know, the same way that Bugs Bunny works on several levels. They would do this live action stuff ostensibly about an apartment building in Toronto and the people who work there and live there. And Dan Aykroyd played a cop whose name was Purvis McBickle.
Thank you, Mr.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bickle, Purvis Bickle. I am the building superintendent.
Which is like obviously a play on Travis Bickle. So I wouldn't have known the Taxi Driver reference when I was a kid. And then, and John Candy played some other character. And so it's a character I can't pronounce with several vowels, several consonants, and I believe a Polish origin. And I liked him. And then he was on a serious role on a show called Police Surgeon, which is also a show it's also called Simon
That sounds
Locke
like an
MD.
SCTV parody show.
It does. Yeah, because it's a high
He's a
concept.
police officer and a surgeon? Is that the...
Yeah, we need a cop and a doctor. And it was this good-looking, square-jawed guy, this guy named Sam Groom, who played Simon Locke, ND, and his, impossibly good-looking. He'd show up in an ambulance as a forensic investigator. I think they didn't have a word for that in those days, but so police surgeon. And it was exported as Simon Locke MD, which I think they realized the title was dumb. But John Candy played two people, and one, I believe we say, emotionally disturbed person who gets into all kinds of trouble and has to be talked down.
That's Will. He's not supposed to be here. They're not married anymore.
It's none of your business.
She's my sister.
Richie, please, stay out of it!
Come on, Val, I never kissed her.
And that role is very interesting because it gives a glimpse into the vulnerability of John Candy that would later surface in other characters, even as later in, oh my God, the one we played a cop at the Chris Columbus film. Oh, I'm blanking on it. Oh my God. I wrote the damn book. But you know what I mean? The one where he plays a cop in Chicago.
Yeah.
Do you remember the name? I'm blanking on the name.
Was it Only the Lonely? Was it that one?
Oh, of course, it's Only the Lonely.
Yeah.
Yes, of course it is. And of course I said it. I knew it right away. But yeah, I think I've been doing too many talks about the book. But I mean, I love it. But it's just like, sometimes I have my facts and figures all over the map. That film showed the vulnerability that he had even in it. Okay, that's all.
Do you ever watch, when he was on the David Steinberg show? Which got me Googling, and there's only one clip on YouTube, but not of John Candy.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. Then we saw him on the David Steinberg, and I knew David Steinberg's work as a kid even because he'd been on the Smothers Brothers, which I loved. And he also, Canadians know other Canadians. Canadians, identify them, So David Steinberg, being from Canada but having made it in the States, did a show in Canada. And for his backing cast, he used Candy, Joe Flaherty, I think sometimes Andrea Martin was on it, and other actors, but it was like the Jack Benny show. It was like David Steinberg had a TV show, a variety show, but he would go across the street to a diner and watch the show on TV at the diner, but then there'd be this whole subplot, stuff that's happening in his life. I guess like Seinfeld in a weird way, in the sense that there's a subplot and then there's a performance part. But anyway, Candy was one of the people who was a regular character. And so we knew his work. And then I heard that they were all from Second City. And then we were big fans of Saturday Night Live at this point. And we heard that Second City are starting their own version of Saturday Night Live. And it was SCTV.
Yeah, because Lauren was coming in and poaching all the talent. Yeah.
I mean, I could not believe how amazing SCTV was and how much I related to it as a guy who grew up in Toronto.
There were 6 people who loved to watch television, but they didn't like what they saw. So they decided to do something about it.
Much like we said about the last time we talked about the kids in the hall, it had a voice that was from my neighborhood, and there's something.
Could you explain that a little bit more? Like, what would exactly be a voice from your neighborhood? And again, we've all watched all the SCTV.
Sometimes literally, sometimes
just
literally
like accents, or
sometimes literally an accent. Sometimes it's turns of phrase, and that are specific to this. Especially in those days, there was a lot of British and Scottish crossover in Canada. Like a lot of people moved. If they wanted to move to North America from the UK, they would move to Canada because it felt a little like they think they had the Queen on the money as part of it, and they knew how to make a cup of tea. So a lot of this sort of tonality of the regional. It was regional, and I recognized the Aboots and all those things in their voices. But then also there was something peculiar to the Canadian attitude towards the government or attitude towards aggravation. Bill Needle, Abe Thomas's character, was always aggravated about something. I recognized that in there's local characters who were doing that. And, literally the SCTV news was Floyd Robertson and Earl Camembert. And those two characters are based on Lloyd Robertson and Earl Cameron, who were the CTV and CBC anchors at the time. So there was, you knew what the in-jokes were if you're from where I'm from, and Candy was on that. And just Johnny LaRue, like once you start seeing Johnny LaRue on SCTV, you're like, okay, I gotta get this all the time.
Do you think without like the pure arrogance, Johnny LaRue is the best alter ego or kind of side of John Candy, or how John Candy would like to have been perceived without being such a dick?
Oh, hi, I'm Johnny LaRue. And I want your vote. Now, I'm not gonna beg you to vote for me. Now, a lot of people criticize me for being in show business. They say that actors should stay out of politics. Well, I'd like to see one of them try to handle a tricky role like Hamlet or Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman.
Yeah, well, I also think that he also worked out. We all have a tendency, especially at the younger ages, to sort of want to be assertive in an aggressive way, especially, men, and I think he saw a kind of behavior of an insecure, it's funny because Hank from the Larry Sanders Show is very similar in the sense that he thinks he's a big man. He's projecting big man, but really everyone can see he's a loser. And he's trying too hard, and he's trying to get his strength through reflected glory, so he doesn't have any inner strength. This is very serious. I guess my other job is psychologist. I'm kidding, but Johnny LaRue had this thing where he would always want to show that he was a big man, like a powerful man. But Guy Caballero could cut the president of SCTV could cut him down, and those scenes between Candy and Flaherty were so great as a metaphor for what was going on in Candy's mind and also what the show was going through in terms of getting corporate sponsors and getting networks.
Yeah, was it the great quote, because they went to film in Edmonton and his quote was something to the effect of, "We held out to the lowest bidder."
Yeah. There's that Canadian self-deprecation, right? And they said that on Letterman, right? I think it was Flaherty and Candy were on the David Letterman show, and they were explaining the pitfalls of filming in Edmonton. One of them, which is that Wednesday nights, their entire crew would go cover the hockey game because they were working for the CBC and doing the hockey game. So they had to basically go dark on Wednesday nights because every camera person, every sound person was over at the Edmonton game.
And is this true? Like the budgets was something like $5,000 an episode, and the salaries were like $250 a week that first season?
Yeah, it was bad. And then some of them got paid extra as writers, but not all of them. And this is a troupe that started as improvisers. So you're writing live, as Catherine Harris said, it's live writing. It's so you are a writer if you're part of an improv troupe. I mean, you could say some people are writing more than others, but there should just be a blanket. And John Candy actually fought for that. John Candy fought for everyone else and himself, but he was really mad that he was getting messed over. But he stood up for Andrea and Catherine too, because they were, it was still those days, I don't even know those days are gone.
Oh, those days aren't gone. It's still horrible. But I think you said like his writing technique would just come in with a napkin with like a few words.
Yeah, but they'd be great words.
Yeah,
you know,
and then Adversary, he had it all fully thought out and formed in his brain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to compare, because you did talk to me about The Kids in the Hall. Mark McKinney in The Kids in the Hall was a character actor who, once he got into costume, could go for hours in a costume character, right? But he didn't necessarily do all the sitting down writing before he did that the other guys did. So there was always this tension within the group about how they approached what a writer was. Foley and Kevin McDonald were very, let's type it down, type out everything, work it out the old fashioned way, like the Dick Van Dyke Show, And so Mark used to think he wasn't sure if he was a writer because he would get in with hardly anything. But then what did he do with it? He did Chicken Lady, So
Yes.
John Candy had the same thing, to bring it back to John Candy. John Candy had the same thing where once he was dressed as Divine, the actor, he could go for hours in that character. Or Johnny LaRue, he could just make up Johnny LaRue stuff off the top of his head. So once he had a Johnny LaRue premise like Street Beef, which was, I don't know if you guys know this.
I think that was the crane shot was involved with that.
Yeah, that's the famous crane shot. And that's all about Edmonton. That's all about, there's a whole thing there. Johnny LaRue represented SCTV in that moment because they weren't getting the budget to do film pieces. And Johnny LaRue on the show would cause trouble for Guy Caballero because he would always say, I want to do this thing with a huge budget. And then he's like, you gotta do that, and he'd yell at him. And then, literally they used a headline from a real headline. Marvin Kitman in Newsday had said something about SCTV being out of control or something like that. And so he said, Kitman says we're out of control, and it was all worked into the show. And then so Johnny gets demoted to a one camera, one microphone street interview thing called Street Beef. And he's like, what am I going to do with this thing? And he gets drunk on the street, and it's Christmas, and he passes out, and then Santa Claus shows up with his crane shot, in a very Martin Scorsese shot from above thing. Here you go, Johnny, your crane shot.
Care to join me in making a snow angel? If you turn off the light, I'll show you the secret.
You'll need that light, Johnny,
What?
for the shot.
What shot?
Why, your crane shot.
Huh?
Merry Christmas, Johnny. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Merry Christmas.
And it was so inside, right? But when you're a kid like me, who's like a comedy nerd already, and my two brothers were also comedy nerds, we'd sit there and go, oh my God, they're making fun of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And this is before Mr. Show. This is before Kids in the Halls, and so the alt comedy of TV sketch comedy was starting to happen on SCTV with John Candy. So I think it's really exciting.
He was so young too. I mean, again, I think when he started at Second City, he was like 23. And that story of his audition, tell everyone about that. It's so great because he wasn't even planning on auditioning.
Yeah, so a recurring character in the book, you'll see that there's a foreword by Dan Aykroyd, and then there's a eulogy from Dan Aykroyd that he said that he delivered in Los Angeles. So in the middle there are several key Dan Aykroyd moments, and this one is Dan Aykroyd and Valerie Bromfield, a great actor, writer, who was also Dan Aykroyd's comedy partner at the time. They were in Toronto, and they had befriended John Candy, and Candy wasn't sure what he was doing with it. He was a theater actor.
Wasn't he a door-to-door napkin salesman?
Yeah, he was a paper salesman. Yeah, he was a paper product salesman.
Which I bet, was because, what a treat if you got a knock on your door.
Well, and Aykroyd gave me so much time, and he told me so many great stories about him, about Candy showing up in his business suit and his Chevrolet with the trunk with his samples in the back. But they were all trying to do something in comedy or in theater. And Candy had done kids theater with Valerie Bromfield. So she said, you got to meet Danny Aykroyd. So then they all hang out. And then this moment, the Chicago Second City decides they're going to open it. They're doing really well when they tour to Toronto. So they say, well, maybe Toronto could have their own Second City troupe, but we have to do auditions. So Dan and Valerie say to John, we're going down to audition for this. And he's like, I don't want to do that. But then, we're going to have lunch anyway. So why don't you come down, sit off to the side, we'll do our auditions, and then we'll all go eat. So, of course, Danny and Val put his name in, John's name, and John gets, and this is like Del Close, one of the comedy gurus of that generation.
Del Close is Del Close of improv.
Yeah, he's the Del Close of improv.
Of that era. Yeah.
So this is literally a moment where destiny and fate and all those things are intervening, because he calls John Candy up, and John's really surprised, and he's told this story, and everyone's told that story in various interviews I've read, and Aykroyd told it to me too. And he gets up and he does a fairly good improv. He doesn't really know what he's doing, but he knows how to be. He's already kind of John Candy at this moment, but he doesn't know the rules of sketch comedy or improv comedy. So Bernie Solins, who was starting the Toronto Theater from Chicago, but he said, I don't think the kid's ready. But Del Close was up there and he said, I think we could make a man out of this guy. So he basically, it's like boot camp. He basically sends him to his version of the Beatles' Hamburg. So he says, you come down to Chicago, we'll put you in the cast with some other newbies and other people like, I think one of the Belushis was still there. I think it was just before John Belushi went off to the National Lampoon or something. So he got to watch other comics, and David Rashi from Succession was part of this cast, which I think is hilarious. Like, one of the lawyers from Succession was actually at the Second City at this time. Anyway, and also a young Bill Murray. So young Bill Murray, who hadn't had a lot of experience, was suddenly learning the ropes with John Candy, but also showing John Candy Chicago, showing him the big city. So it's like this whole hero's journey, right? He gets to see the Loop, he gets to see the blues joints and all this. And so then he does fairly well there after a while, but it's touch and go, but he gets good at it, and then gets pulled back to Toronto because I guess he missed home, but also they wanted him. They wanted him to really establish the Toronto theater. So suddenly he's working with Gilda at first, and then Catherine O'Hara, and Danny comes and goes into the cast at this point, and Eugene Levy, all these people, and Joe Flaherty, and and Brian Doyle Murray for a short time. And so all these people create what is the Toronto Second City, which has its own flavor than the Chicago Second City, which is something that Joe Flaherty was insistent upon making me know, is that it was not like the Chicago Second City. In some ways, he wished it was. In other ways, he was excited that they were creating their own for Toronto comedy.
Yeah, wasn't it, though, Second City is such an iconic institution. I mean, basically, the Brooklyn one's just right down the street, and it's like almost a city block here. But like those early Toronto days, it was kind of like on a, they're trying to keep the lights on. Was it before they moved to the Firehouse, which kind of really established them?
Yeah.
What was it, like a 50-seat, 80-seat?
Yeah, it was a little theater on Adelaide Street in Toronto, and they didn't have a liquor license. They didn't have a liquor license. So I think they didn't have air conditioning for the first summer. And so there was all this craziness. And if you ordered food there, they'd have to go, the waitresses would go to a different restaurant to bring the food over, and then actually Catherine O'Hara and her sister, Mary Margaret O'Hara, started in the kitchen and as waiters. Gilda's understudy was Catherine O'Hara. And so when Gilda left, a gay Catherine had shot, and she had taken workshops with John.
Crazy young too. Wasn't she like 19 or something?
I think she was 18 when she first started hanging around there.
Yeah.
And the reason I know this is because, full disclosure, my own brother, Mike, was one of the youngest Second City males ever to be in Second City at the time when he was at Second City. It's inescapable that Mike's journey at Second City and then SNL is interlinked with John Candy's story, because Mike also had a Chicago sojourn. Like, he also had a period where he was sent to Chicago to learn more things. And he got into Second City Workshop directly because, as a fan of John Candy.
Yeah, you have that great anecdote in the book about him waiting. Like, he's only waited backstage for two people, Lily Tomlin and John Candy.
I know. Good taste, eh? Yeah, so he waits at the stage door. They're doing a promotional appearance in Toronto for Big City Comedy, which was John Candy's short-lived spin-off from Second City, where he kind of went on his own. And Tim Kazurinsky was in that show too. And Tim and John Candy were at the stage door, and Mike goes up to him and says, "Excuse me, Mr. Candy, sir, how do I get into comedy?" And anyone else could have given an answer that was, "Don't bother me, kid," or it could have been, "It's who you know," or something really, sarcastic,
snarky,
or
yeah.
"You'll never make it. Don't even try." He said, "Go to Second City. They have workshop classes. See if you like it." Now, you didn't just say, "See if you're any good at it." He said, "See if you like it. And if you like it, take the classes and keep going. And if you're good at it, you'll want to do it. You want to learn more, and you might never get anywhere other than the classes. But if you're enjoying the classes and you're getting better at it, then you'll have skills that will help you. And it's like, he didn't say you're going to get discovered. Nowadays everyone's like, what YouTube channel do I go on to become a huge star? And, there are more avenues to do that, I guess. But this was really practical advice that it was basically like stay in school, but it was stay in comedy school. And then, but also I was also really touched by the part where he said, just see if you like it. Because, there's no sense devoting your life to something. And Mark Maron talks about this. I've heard him talk about people who want to get into stand-up. He goes, well, picture yourself doing it for 20 years in front of nobody and tell me if you're still interested. And that is an important, that's Mark's way of doing that.
Yeah.
But that is a really important thing to tell people, because everyone wants something wonderful right away, to quote a famous book. And you don't get it right away, but if it is wonderful, if there's wonderful in it, and you stick with it, you'll enjoy the journey, So Candy gave that advice to Mike, and then Mike took it, and, it was great.
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
I think you probably touched on this, but the low budgetness of the original Second City, where they didn't have any, a budget for props or makeup, put the characterization so much better when they finally made the jump to SCTV. I think you used as an example, there's a Joe Flaherty Candy sketch where they're hockey players, and it's like a Wheaties commercial.
I'm Guy Lafleur. I'm Daryl Sittler. And I use a Daryl Sittler hockey stick. I use Guy Lafleur hockey stick. Hey, Guy, how about some cornerbacks, eh? All right, sure thing, Daryl. Oh, boy, I bet these are good, huh? Oh, yeah. Real malt flavor. Smells good, too. Well, I can't do these things.
Yeah.
But they first did it, like, on stage, no makeup. But so they had to put that extra characterization into it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is, John Candy was playing a then Toronto Maple Leafs character named a real person named Daryl Sittler. I don't think they call him Daryl Sittler, but he was based on Daryl Sittler. And everyone knew that this big John Candy, who looked nothing like this, in shape hockey player, they all knew that he was physicalizing a man much slimmer and more in better shape than himself. And John wasn't as big in those days, but he was the biggest guy in the cast. And Flaherty played a French Canadian hockey player. I think it was Guy Lafleur or something. But it wasn't. They didn't call them that. And it was like based on a Weetabix, which is a cereal, but it was called like Cornabix or something like that, or something like it was like. And they did this sketch. It was just about two hockey players doing a I love my Weetabix, eh? Like the cereal is good for me, eh? And it was so. Oh, by the way, isn't that funny? Because one of John Candy's first acting jobs was in a Colgate toothpaste commercial where he played a football player.
Yeah, because he 6'4" him was a good football player until he blew his knees out.
Yeah, exactly. He was a football player, and then when he becomes an actor, they go, "Well, we'll cast you as a football player." And then the whole premise of the commercial is that his helmet protects his head the way that Colgate's invisible shield protects your teeth. But anyway, so he'd already done a real TV commercial like that. So he'd done a couple of beer commercials as well. But so by the time, he was doing this on stage, he'd already done actual commercials. So there's a kind of there's a John Gielgud, I think it was, it was Laurence Olivier. And he's, have you considered acting, my boy? He says to Dustin Hoffman. And it's like just good old fashioned acting. You don't need prosthetics. You don't need to immerse yourself in the character's life for 3 years. You can, everyone's got their own method, but if you just act, and that's a Del Close thing, I think. Now that I think about it, Del Close would always say, if you're playing a piano player and you don't know how to play the piano, pretend you do.
I'm trying to use the phone!
Yeah, do you think like John Candy is like the epitome of Del Close style improv that took it out from the stage Second City into a large film career? That's style of learning and education and skills, lived on throughout his career.
Yeah, that's definitely, there's a thesis there that John Candy is. I mean, Bill Murray also might be one who took, he took the same classes, or I don't know if he took the classes, but he took the same note and went with it, but I think Candy for sure, because if you look at what Candy did was, and this is the thing that I've spoken to many people at the Second City organization over the years. At their most pretentious, they refer to themselves as living the comedy theater, like living theater. Like, so it's not just comedy writing. They're trying to enact human life. And that's something that I'm paraphrasing wildly here, but something that Del Close talked about. I've watched seminars of his, and he talked about, the Upright Citizens Brigade comes out of that. Yeah. That whole approach to comedy where it's sometimes confrontational improv, and they're trying to show the humanity in it. And you don't have to know this to find it funny, but if you're wondering why an uncomfortable laugh sometimes happens in certain scenes, that's because they're doing that on purpose. So there's a lot of smart. This came out of an era, like David Steinberg comes out of an era of trying to be smart with it, and certainly Nichols and May from Chicago, that whole improv scene in Chicago, and the Compass Players and the original Second City, they were all really smart people like Alan Arkin. And so there's definitely, at its worst, they're pretentious, but I like it. So I'm a fan. But at its best, it's like, oh my God, they made you laugh on a high concept and you didn't even know it because you just found it funny. That should be the way, right? Like, you just react to it. Sorry, I'm long-winded today, but the analogy I also make is Beatles.
Long-winded way. That's what interviews are for.
Okay, so I'm a huge scholar of the Beatles. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I certainly know way too much about this one band. But let me say this. One of the things that's great about it is you can get a musical analyst analyzing, particularly with McCartney. He goes to a diatonic major third here. Look at that genius move that no one's done this since Shostakovich. And I'm sure McCartney didn't really know that. He just knew emotionally he was willing to go to a place that was smart because it felt good. Sometimes McCartney probably did know a few things he picked up from a lesson, but the truth is you can analyze it, but it works. So you can do both. You can have Python is the same. You can analyze a Python sketch and look at its context. But, maybe you just laugh at the two silly ladies talking about it, a penguin exploding on a TV.
Yeah, or a fish.
Yeah, a man being slapped with a fish. Absolutely. Or now it's 10 o'clock and time for all penguins on top of TVs to explode. And you could also know that that's based on the kind of humor of Spike Milligan and the Goons. But this is for nerds like me to work out. But you can just laugh. You don't have to be smart about it. You don't have to think to get this stuff. But when you start digging under the hood, it's fascinating to see where the wire, and this gets back to what we were talking about being an interviewer. Is like, you get to ask somebody, hey, were you guys doing this? And then like, look at me walking around like Columbo, I got one more question for you. It literally, I'm in there with the trench coat and the little folder, it's fun.
Yeah. And again, there's more like, about a year ago, I went down this Elliot Gould rabbit hole, and I came across, what's the name of the movie he filmed in Toronto?
Oh, The Silent Partner.
Yeah, Silent Partner. So I was just there for Elliot Gould, not knowing much about the movie. I just wanted to go, let's go through Elliot Gould's movies of the 1970s. And then boom, there's John Candy just playing a role,
Yeah, and it was one of his earliest films too.
Yeah.
But he gets to be kind of two things in that film. He gets to be the comic relief, the nice guy at the bank. He works in the bank, and he gets the girl, which is, I use that in quotes, like gets the girl. Like there's a pretty blonde teller at the bank, and she likes him. So not Elliot Gould, not Christopher Plummer. So it's kind of a, and like look at the cast of that movie. Like Christopher Plummer's in that, and it's a scary, at times violent movie. But it's a great jumping off point for, Candy's filming it literally steps away from that Second City theater that we were just talking about. And it's also talk about connections. They shot that at the Toronto Eaton's Center. And that was where I had a day job a few years later, working at a restaurant at the foot of the escalator where, spoiler alert, where Santa Claus is shot in the movie. I was there when they were filming that. And it was like so crazy.
Oh, you were there that day?
Yeah. I was a kid. Wow. I said, they're filming a movie. Why is Santa Claus lying down on the escalator? What's going on? But anyway, and funny enough, I don't know if you know the band Sloan, the Canadian band. I was talking to Chris Murphy from Sloan, and he said as a kid, he was there. I think he was a background extra, actually. I think he was a kid actor. I think he was one of the kids that were on camera, like supposed to be shopping. But it's funny. And then I met my wife working in that restaurant in that mall. And so I've been with the same woman, Lisa, for years now. And so we like all these origin stories converge.
All roads go back to John Candy and Elliot Gould.
I just thought of something I've never told anyone. It's also that spot is exactly where years ago when my brother he had auditioned for Saturday Night Live, and he was back in Toronto, and he hadn't heard back. You know, you've heard stories about Saturday Night Live, and he hadn't heard back from Lauren or anybody. And he thought, it was Christmas, in between Christmas and New Year's. We're walking through the Eaton Center at that escalator without really thinking about it. And he says to me, that's it. That's my story. I get to audition for Saturday Night Live, and that's it. Nothing else happens after that. And it was right at that moment that, and we're staying on that spot. And I just realized how weird my life is that these things converge. Again, this is what I was talking about. The history of this John Candy story is in my backyard, where I grew up. I spent 37 years living in Toronto, and I know those streets, like I know every pothole. I hope they fixed them since. But, it's kind of fascinating how many stories are wrapped up in my own life, which is probably the best thing when you're writing about somebody, to sort of relate to it,
Yeah. So I guess, that's a good point to make is how much does John Candy mean to Canada and Toronto compared to in the United States?
Well, you'd have to ask the United States about that. I would say that the reaction I get from Americans is it's different than a lot of Canadian stars that you mentioned. Because, I mentioned earlier that Canadians are good at identifying other Canadians and saying, Neil Young, he's Canadian, eh?
Yeah. Do you think he is the most Canadian of Canadian actors?
Well,
that
that's
also brought so much back to Toronto, which, again, I was going to segue into one thing I learned from your book is he and Wayne Gretzky and a shady businessman bought the Argonauts, the football team.
Yes.
Right out of Hollywood, literally. The PEC News Conference, more people jammed into one little room at the Sky Dome than appeared at any Argos home game last year. The stars, Bruce McNall, sports entrepreneur, John Candy, homegrown movie star, and Wayne Gretzky, homegrown hockey star. And what a show it was.
That was something I didn't know.
Whatever the version of Canadians' version of the American dream is, there's a lot of what you're alluding to is so Candy plays high school football, gets a knee injury, can't play football, was a huge fan of the Toronto Argonauts, and then years later he's managed to turn some of his wealth into entry at the table to go partner with Bruce McNall, Wayne Gretzky, and him, and they buy the Toronto Argonauts franchise and take it to the Grey Cup, which is the equivalent of the Super Bowl. Which is like,
and
that's
they
a
also
movie.
got
That's
like
a little
a
biopic
round,
right there.
Yeah, and they got Rocket, the first round draft pick.
Yeah,
to come to Canada.
Yeah, but the Rocket. Why can't I remember his last name? Rocket. Anyway.
The Rocket.
I gotta start showing up. I gotta start showing up at interviews, having read my book.
Yeah, no. He's just a sub note of that. But the whole point was to be reminded of like some kid who had like electric train set when he was little. Grows up, becomes successful, and then buys, a whole railroad line. John Candy bought the football team. And he wasn't just a passive thing. It was like the height of his film career. He was working the front office, traveling to every city and, promoting the team.
All right, let's see how ticket sales are going for the Toronto Argonauts. Excuse me.
Yeah.
How are the sales going?
Lousy.
Why?
Your crew's blocking the window.
Sorry. All right, everybody out. Let's go.
Were you living in Toronto at that time and
yes,
saw games?
I was still living in Toronto. I never saw a game at that point. I don't know why. I was a huge Argo fan when I was a kid, and then I became an artsy. I became a musician. The Queen Street part of Toronto, which is sort of like, I can't compare it to any, but it's like
I was there. I was there in December. I went to the
so
Rivoli.
It was in those days. Well, this is again back to the whole Kids in the Hall thing. That Rivoli thing. I was a musician playing the Rivoli Club and all those little dive bars that were really cool and art friendly places. And I had sort of done that thing where I wasn't a sports fan anymore. I didn't go to the Leaf games, and although there's a latent thing that when I think about the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey, I if I see them, if I see the uniform, it's like it stirs me again. Like I get interested in hockey for a week. And then much to the chagrin of a lot of my fellow Torontonian friends are like Leaf fans forever. And they think of me as like carpetbagger. When the Leafs are winning, I'll watch the series, but
It's exciting
anyway,
that way.
But yeah, exactly. I like dipping in.
Yeah.
But the Argos, yeah. So I missed the whole all those games that were at the Toronto Sky Dome at the time,
Yeah, but it just seems like, well, it doesn't seem like he did give so much back to Toronto. He bought the football
really did.
team. The Frostbacks, that was his production company.
Yeah, and did I explain in the book the origin of Frostbacks, where that name could possibly have originated?
Well, I kind of heard you say it before because I listened to another interview.
Well, there was a National Lampoon magazine column that was called Canadian Corner, and they often referred, had a little Mountie with icicles coming from his hat, and it was a satirical sort of letter from Canada thing, and it basically they described, the very derogatory term for Mexicans is wetback, which I don't endorse, but so the joke being that Canada, we would call them frostbacks. And I don't think there was any hateful intent in the word frostback, but I definitely the wetback one was. But the National Lampoon book magazine would use this term frostbacks, and I think most Canadians would hear that and laugh their head off. So when John Candy started his production company, he called it Frostbacks. Which I think I wish I'd been able to ask him. I don't know if it was from that or not.
Yeah, wasn't it his time with filmmaker Norman Jewison? They wanted to really kind of have a top-rate studio in Toronto.
Yeah, they really wanted to, because something you learn in Canada is that, especially in that generation, everybody left. Once you got big, you got out of town. And nobody was putting money back in. Like they would film The Silent Partner in Toronto, but it would, be distributed and edited out of the country. And a lot of American productions would shoot in Toronto, but they didn't really have a studio there. And so they would just, use it as a back lot. And then, so somebody said, well, if we could have studios here and an industry, then we would have people who have set dressing jobs and lighting jobs and, rigging and all those things that crews that you need. And you could have a sound stage where everyone could be working all year. We could make a Canadian film business and see ourselves, because representation matters even today with various groups of people when you see yourself on screen. So Canada had always been wrestling with this idea of national identity, and it's coming back again in a whole other unintended way lately. But the whole idea was that if we had a film business that reflected Canada, it would make it, we'd see ourselves and we'd feel good or bad or whatever about ourselves, but we have an idea of who we are. And especially when we have the United States right over here and England across the way. So we have England and the United States sort of giving us ideas about who to be. But then sometimes you want to say, who are we? Little brother syndrome, so that's why Candy and Norman Jewison, who was also a successful expat who never really left his roots of Toronto, they wanted to do this thing. And that they had very successes in certain things. And to this day, there are things like the Toronto International Film Festival that came out of that thinking. But, Candy, again, at that time in his career, running Frostbacks might have been, he was taking on a lot of things, and then the Argos, and it was just, there's a sadness to this part of his life that he lost the plot of the big films,
Yeah, you think, his blessing was his curse. His blessing was he was just nice to everyone. And the curse was he didn't say no to a lot of people, which brings us to, which is a testament to your good writing. Wagons East chapter just riddled me with anxiety. And then I went back and I watched the trailer to it. To me, is like so disturbing because he's on a horse and he's falling off and falling down. And he didn't want to really be there. He didn't really want to do that movie. And, it just ended tragic.
Yeah, no, the whole Wagons East thing, it's such a sad coda to the story. And you can see it on screen. He's more overweight than he's ever been. And they had to finish some of the long shots where his stunt double, because he had passed away in the middle of the shoot. And the conditions that led to that were, pure business crap. It goes all the way back to the fact that John Hughes had a bad experience with Curly Sue or something, or the other one of his other films that was not a Candy film. And, the only franchise that was working was Home Alone, and that was Chris Columbus's baby. And so he was producing films and writing things, but he decided he wasn't going to make movies anymore for a while, and I guess he never did. And so Candy was left without the guy who really understood him. And so, but they had signed to do this movie for Carol Co. called Bartholomew versus Neff, and it was Candy starring against Sylvester Stallone. So when they changed hands on a few things, and then Stallone left. So then now he's trying to get out of his contract, and he owes them a movie. And it was one of those things where he was hoping to run the option out so that he wouldn't have to do the movie, because they had a period where they could say, do this, do this, do this. And then the film company acquired Wagons East. And they said, look, it's a Western, blah, blah, blah. We'll put you with, somebody else. Like in this case, it was Richard Lewis. And he didn't want to do it. Like everyone says that. They had calls with him. I talked to a few people who had phone calls with him where he said, I'm stuck. I really don't want to do this, but I'll just get it over with and I'll get back. And he was going to, I think he was about to start another one of his Pritikin diet periods. And then sadly, his heart gave out while he was there and he passed away. And I appreciate that you said that I wrote that well, because that was one of the hardest things to write, because you don't want to be sensationalistic, but I wanted to tell the story leading up to that about how he lived, so that when you realize what monumental sadness there was when he died, because even though everyone could see that he was out of shape and overweight, he seemed like he could pull out. He seemed like he might have had another shot. And just, I think I mentioned in the book, there had been an earthquake in Los Angeles around this same time. And it really was the second aftershock was him dying, because it was, and Kurt Cobain had OD'd around this time in Rome. So there was all this going on. I think Kurt Cobain actually died like a month later too, after Candy. But around the time that John Candy died, Kurt Cobain had almost died. So there was this weird moment where they had an earthquake, and one of the big rock stars of his generation had a near death and then died. But the day John Candy died, I remember I was at Whistler, BC with my band. We were playing that night, and I was sitting in a cafe and I said, "The world is mourning the loss of John Candy." It literally, and everybody looked at each other like, well, what I hear people did when John Kennedy died. John F. Kennedy. I always hear people say, we're a laundromat. I heard that John F. Kennedy died. And it's like, the world stopped for a second, especially in Canada. Probably everywhere else, but I just remember it so vividly. And then his funeral was on TV, ahead of state. So I really wanted to get across, he had two funerals. Like he had a Los Angeles funeral and a Toronto ceremony. That's the one that was on TV, and just fantastic, tragedy, just epic. And, it could be a biopic in its own, I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but I always think there'd be a movie in the story of him acquiring the Toronto Argonauts and make it like Cool Runnings, make it a sports movie.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
About a millionaire comedian, a hockey player, and how do we speak of Bruce McDowell? Call him a dubious businessman.
Dubious businessman.
Yeah. There are legal things we could call him, but I don't even know. I don't want to get myself in any further trouble, But he definitely has a history of questionable business ethics,
Yeah.
But anyway, that story of them actually taking them to the Grey Cup, and at the same time when there's a lot of unanswered questions from the front office, So I think it's unescapably sad though, because at the same time, Candy came away with a very bitter feeling about the whole business after that.
And just a couple last questions here. What from Dan Aykroyd's eulogy, what lines really stick out to you?
I want to refer to it actually, because, well, I like that he talked about he talked about them in terms of being stentorian, almost Roman warriors, and that he kind of, Dan Aykroyd, I call him Dan sometimes, even though I don't really know him. I've spoken to him, but we're not buds, but I feel like Danny he endeared himself to me in this period, because I really learned a lot about his humanity, but also his eloquence. And I think he's an unsung writer. I think even the films that didn't work that Dan Aykroyd created, like Nothing But Trouble, I think it was an epic disaster. I think he swung for the fences, and sometimes it worked. Ghostbusters, Blues Brothers.
Yeah.
And sometimes it didn't. Dr. Detroit, but I mean, people can have their opinions about those things, but Dan Aykroyd is a big thinker. He's a big thinker. And when he sits down to write, and he wrote the foreword too for this book, when he sits down to write, he has a way of measuring words. He's a poet. And so when he speaks about the two of them being, they used to play this game where they pretended they were in a badly dubbed Italian, sandal epic, and they would make their mouths not move in sync, but they would say things like, I will walk over there and I will tell that man what to do, like the badly dubbed English. And they would do that for hours, and Candy would do it with other people too. So Aykroyd brought that out in this eulogy in front of the family with a bunch of sad comedians and actors who were sad. They got big laughs because, I hope it's not a horrible thing to say, but he killed at the funeral. He slayed. And to the point where people were laughing at the squeaking wheels of the casket, and just, to me, getting inside that room as a writer, like piecing it together, and then the big funeral procession on the 405 with the LAPD closing the lanes of traffic. But Aykroyd's speech, to answer your question, just the way he referred to him being the nation of Canada, like he said, he's as wide and big as Canada, and all this just beautiful imagery. To put one line would probably be, I really made sure we got it in the book because it's actually available at the Beverly Hills, the Hollywood Museum. Not the one near LACMA, but the one in Beverly Hills. They have the original speech, which is, I have to thank Jason Bailey, who's a journalist who was doing some research on Candy, and he said, "Hey, do you want this?" And he sent me a PDF of it, which is like, Jason Bailey writes for Vanity Fair sometimes. It was very helpful, but I didn't get to go to see it, but I saw it, and Aykroyd said you can use it if you can find it, but I don't have it written down anywhere. So the only stipulation was from the museum was that I didn't use the photograph of it because that item is theirs. But if you can transcribe it, you can use it. So that was great. And then that's why I asked him to write the foreword, because I thought, you wrote the ending, you should probably write the beginning. And he said yes.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then what did you learn about John Candy that really sticks out that you did not know before going into this project?
I think I'd heard about the anxiety and the darkness, and certainly other stories had been very
that's
sensational.
another thing that hit me, like when he didn't want to go to the mall alone. As one who has anxiety, because again, I think it's like he didn't want to let anyone down by not coming across as a nice guy.
Yes, and that's what it is. He was a people pleaser, mainly because I think he used social interaction as a way of drowning out those moments of being alone. And I again, I'm not a doctor, and I also didn't know him personally, but the profile you get from people you talk to who knew him is that he didn't like to be alone. He'd phone people all night. I think he drank socially. I think he also, I'm an addict myself, recovering, thankfully. And I know that one of the things you do is you try to slow down your brain. I'm projecting my thing onto him. So I don't know if he did that, but I know that there's a tendency to want to numb some of your awareness, which I've gotten over. Thankfully, I'm dealing with it. But he also was a people pleaser for that reason, because he knew that people were going to save him. And he could save people. He had a gift for it. So he thought, well, I got to be doing this. But then he had to start hiring people to pull him away. Bob Crane Jr., he had this guy who was a Toronto Argonaut who became his bodyguard. That's the Calgary Mall scene you're talking about.
Yeah. And by the way, Bob Crane, that was another thing that I Googled. That's actually Hogan's Heroes / tripod bludgeon murder victim, Bob Crane's son.
Yeah.
In his inner circle.
Robert Crane has written about his own father's weird, tragic life, but Robert Crane Jr. ends up being a journalist interviewing John Candy so much that they hit it off to the point where John Candy says, "You should come work for me as my press liaison." And then it just becomes this thing where it's kind of an Elvis Memphis mafia where he has like 4 or 5 people that are in the inner circle with Candy, making sure he gets places, and making sure the dressing room is right, making sure the trailer is right, So so they call themselves the Chongos, which I never got an actual definition from anyone, but That was just the term they used. I think it was just like honchos, I think it was just hanging out.
You want to hurt me? Go right ahead if it makes you feel any better. I'm an easy target. Yeah, you're right. I talk too much. I also listen too much. I could be a cold-hearted cynic like you. But I don't like to hurt people's feelings. Well, you think what you want about me. I'm not changing. I like me. My wife likes me. My customers like me. Because I'm the real article. What you see is what you get.
Lastly, I guess it's almost the same question. Why do you think people connect so much with John Candy, and what is his place in comedy history? Being this podcast is comedy history.
First, I think that people relate to his humanity. I think it's almost a cliche maybe, but you look at the sparkle, there's a photograph on the cover of my book. You see the sparkle in his eyes. Everyone sees the vulnerability. A lot of comics don't have, a lot of comedian actors don't have that. They have a different kind of aggressive attitude. But he had a vulnerability that, people wanted to cuddle him. They wanted to hug him. And he also brought like a character like Del Griffith. It's no secret that my first chapter of my book is I Like Me, which is the speech from Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And in the Colin Hanks's film is also called I Like Me. We all get the thing we see about John Candy is that this is a guy who could have been underestimated, but stood up for himself and everyone else. So that vulnerability and being willing to be human in the service of comedy and storytelling, how could you not like this guy? So it's definitely and what was the second part of your question?
What's his place in comedy history?
I think John Candy advanced there's maybe two things. Sorry. He advanced the large guy comedy thing to include that vulnerability, whereas I think Belushi could have done it if he had managed his life differently. But Belushi had brought something to the big buffoon guy, and then Candy brought a subtlety to it. And then, Farley went back to the buffoon guy. So, but in terms of big guy comedy, the other thing I think is that for a brief time, nice underestimated guys became the center of comic storytelling in the 80s, 90s, 80s mostly. That's really the period of Candy's brilliance. Certainly my favorite film is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles because it's the convergence of John Hughes really getting Candy and also getting Neil Page's character, Steve Martin's character, Neil, and really writing human people in extreme situations. And that the comedy, goes back to Del Close, right? Humanity within extreme situations. So I think that's what he brought into it.
Very cool. And where can people find the book? It's coming out October 7th, if I'm correct.
October 7th, everywhere. You can order it online from your favorite order place, or you can go to your local independent bookseller. And if you're at any of the dates, I'm not sure how to tell you my link. I'll give you the information later. But if you go to, I'm going on tour. That tour is going to be adding dates too. So I'm going to be in right now a few places like Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, New York, even Portland. I live in the Bay Area, so I'm doing San Francisco and Berkeley. And then we don't have a Los Angeles date yet. So we're trying to make that happen because I think there's a lot of comedy fans in Los Angeles. I heard. Yeah, and certainly a lot of the people who are in the book are in Los Angeles, like Tom Hanks and people like that. So it was really great for me to talk to all those people. By the way, just like being on the phone with Steve Martin or Tom
who was
Hanks
your favorite person to interview out of the group? That just again, I get that with
three.
Just
Okay, I'll give you three.
Yeah,
I'll give you three. So Dan Aykroyd, like I said, I had the big revelation. I was like, oh my God, this guy knows how to tell a story. Tom Hanks just gave me like an hour and a half of. He gets going and he's excited and he doesn't know me from Adam and he suddenly he just wants to tell me, again, this is all for John, right? He wants to make sure I get his full take on John Candy. And then the third was Catherine O'Hara, because I absolutely adore Catherine O'Hara and have since SCTV. So to have her give me the time of day and then tell me all this beautiful stuff because she really loved John Candy. She did one of the eulogies in his Toronto funeral. and just to really, she really wanted it to be handled well, that what she said in the book. So those three were like, and I love that I got to talk to Joe Flaherty for 3 hours and Dave Thomas.
Yeah, what a treat.
And those guys were useful. Like, let me tell you, they were like Dave Thomas. I didn't use all of what he said. Like a lot of times you can't, it's just too much, and you have to be judicious to make your word count fit. But yeah, and then Joe Flaherty, who's passed away since, so it's even more special that I had a chance to speak with him,
Very cool. Paul, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I really enjoyed the book.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to me.
And so we wrap up another episode of Comedy History 101. You got schooled in comedy. Yes, be sure to check out Paul's book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Also, the quick plugs. September 11th, 9:30 at the Players Theater in the Village, AI versus Human Roast Battle. September 18th, Thursday at Young Ethel's in Park Slope, That 80s Improv Challenge. And on Friday, September 26th, at the Red Room above the KGB bar in the Lower East Side, Tale, NYC's finest storytelling. And you can find out all about these show dates on my site, harmonleon.com, or on the social medias at harmonleon. And show Comedy History 101 some love. Like, subscribe, comment, give us 5 stars on iTunes, Spotify. Follow us on Instagram, ComedyHist101, or on our site, comedyhistory101.com. And until next time, bye.
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
I'm trying to use the phone!
Excuse me! Comedy History 101.